Josh, it is a real honor and a privilege to be able to talk to you. I know you are in the middle of a grueling book tour at the moment. It's really an honor to be able to do this. Welcome to the show, man. It's great to meet you.
Thanks. It's a pleasure, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. I always like to start these conversations just with kind of getting the basic background of guests' interests and their expertise. What is what has been your just general life interest in China and its surveillance state in general? What is the background of what got you interested in the first place?
Yeah, well, I've been interested in China most of my adult life. It probably actually started in childhood. I'm half Chinese. Started going to China. My first trip to China was in 1991 when I was just like 14 years old. And I just got kind of hooked on the place. And partly it was because it was not at all what I expected it to be. I'd sort of grown up with this idea of China as like being like San Francisco, right? Like that's my grandfather's from Northern California, and he would take me on trips to Chinatown. And I thought, when I was a kid, I actually thought San Francisco was China for a while. And so, my first trip there, I was going in with these kind of visions of, San Francisco, kind of like lots of, activity signs, signs in Chinese, restaurants, lots of noise and activity. And we got there and it was this just gray, kind of dull communist state, right? Everyone was wearing, one of two shades of clothing, just thousands and thousands of bicycles and donkey carts and, not a restaurant, not a freestanding restaurant to be seen anywhere. And I think just that sort of contrast, that conflict between my expectations of China and what actually I saw when I went there really kind of piqued my interest. Totally, completely apart from sort of, root seeking or anything family related, right? It was just the strangeness of it. And so, over time, I went to college, I studied Mandarin, found a way back to China after I graduated from college doing journalism, and then eventually caught on with the Wall Street Journal. And I was working for them in 2016 and 2017 when, you started to notice this really fascinating shift, really surprising shift in China, which is that, for decades and for, my entire experience, the duration of my entire experience in China, the Communist Party had been sort of trying to remove itself from the personal lives of Chinese citizens. They'd sort of, after the Cultural Revolution, the party sort of was mostly interested in kind of delivering economic growth and maintaining political control, but kind of otherwise getting out of the way. Right, just letting people mostly live their lives, and and a few years after the current Chinese leader Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, that reversed, and the party started having many more opinions about about how people live their lives, how society should be run, and they were really inserting themselves into people's lives in kind of unexpected ways, or so in some really intrusive ways. You had kind of these like neighborhood committee members who were sort of going around door to door and sort of snooping into people's affairs more. And then, we noticed in 2017, my co-author, Lisa, who's a tech reporter for the Wall Street Journal, she noticed a bunch of money going into these startups in China that were doing AI, and they were doing this one specific area of AI known as computer vision, right, which is teaching machines how to recognize objects. And it was a relatively new field, at least to us. And we she called me up. She's like, "Oh, I'm going to go visit this company in Beijing. Do you want to come along? It sounds like they're kind of involved in surveillance, which I know is something you're interested in." And we went there, and it was just this, at the time, crazy scene. Just these, they had these cameras set up on the, an intersection outside their office. And their systems were labeling the video footage in real time, so like a car would go by and it would label that car as like a, gray BMW, and guess at the model year, or like a person would ride by on a bicycle and be like bicycle rider wearing a red shirt, that sort of thing, right? And it was just kind of, and the aim of that, all of that, was so that police could search video footage really quickly. And now that sort of technology is spread pretty widely, but at the time it was novel and really kind of sci-fi, and we were pretty blown away by it. And then it turned out it was a real business. They were selling these systems to police departments all over China, and we just felt like this is kind of a big development. Even in a country like China, where you're used to the government snooping on people, this was like a whole new level. And so that's how we got into it.
Yeah. And when you started to notice this activity, obviously roughly 5 years has elapsed between then and now, but did you anticipate, or did you have just kind of a spidey sense that this was heading in a specific kind of direction in terms of the quantity of surveillance and the level of detail that it has really become?
Honestly, at the time, that first story, it was kind of like a gee whiz story. It was like, and China really specializes in producing a lot of those, right? It's just this massive country with a lot of money and a really powerful government and just all kinds of crazy stuff going on, huge amounts of economic growth. So every once in a while you would run across a story and just be like, wow, that's interesting. I never thought that would happen. So that's kind of where it started. But, the more we looked into it, we realized actually this isn't just like a tech startup story, right? That this is part of a big shift in the way that Communist Party wants to rule China, and that they had sort of written these technologies into a whole new reboot of their sort of version of authoritarianism. And the moment I think this really hit home was when I went with a colleague in late 2017 out to Xinjiang, which is this region way out in northwestern China, remote region. Some of your listeners probably have heard of it. It's big, twice the size of Texas, has a lot of natural resources, and has always been the kind of place has always been a place that Chinese leaders for centuries have wanted to control and tried to control, but struggled to, because the people there are mostly Turkic Muslims, have very little in common with Chinese people culturally or linguistically or religiously. And so, there'd been a lot of conflict, some violence, and the Communist Party was using these technologies. We heard that the Communist Party was using these technologies out there, and we weren't quite sure why. And so a colleague and I, we rented a car, we drove in, and it was, like driving into some sort of dystopian counterinsurgency operation, where they had just this, the whole region was blanketed in every form of technology that we'd found earlier, right? So you had facial recognition, you had iris recognition, you had, microphones recording voices, security gates everywhere. And it was all targeting Uyghurs, mostly the sort of main ethnic group out there. And it was this, and what they were doing with the technology was just so shocking when we finally talked to people, right? When we found out that essentially they were using surveillance technology to collect data on every Uyghur in the region, all 12 million people. And they were basically collecting all that data on a centralized platform, which is the sort of platform that was developed basically for joint military operations in the war on terror, to sort of collect intelligence on insurgents and terrorists. And the way it was being used in Xinjiang was to track and categorize individual people according to the potential threat that they might pose to Communist Party rule in the future. And then, those people who were deemed to be threatening or quote unquote unsafe were being sent to this newly built gulag of internment camps. And it was just this really, I think when it dawned on us what was going on there, it was just so, it was dark in a way that I'd never really contemplated in China, in my whole career in China. And so we just felt like, this is definitely something new. And that's when I think, the seeds of the book were sown with that trip.
Yeah. And I know you open the book with an account of the situation of the Uyghurs and go into some detail as to what is happening to the people there. And what one of, someone who read that section, people just seem to disappear. I mean, there is something reminiscent to me just of what was going on with the Gestapo and with the Soviet Union totalitarianism. For people who are completely unfamiliar with the situation of what is going on, you just mentioned the millions of Uyghurs that live there. Talk about what it's like to be living under that rule with that type of technology. What is that lived experience like for the people in that situation?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is particularly that time when it was really ramping up and at its most intense. If you were a Uyghur sort of going about your daily life in Xinjiang, in a city like Urumqi, like the capital, for example, the minute you step out your door, you're sort of basically being tracked all of the time, right? And so anywhere you want to go that's public, whether it's a bank or a bazaar, a market, or a hotel, anything like that, you have to pass through a security checkpoint where you're scanning your ID card and your face, and they're matching your face to your ID card, and that provides a record of everywhere you go in public. If you've done anything wrong, we met a guy, for example, who had forgotten to pay his phone bill for 3 months, or neglected to pay his phone bill for 3 months. Who was on some sort of list as a result. So if you've done something wrong like him, if you scan your ID card at a security gate, it will go off, an alarm will go off, right? And the cops there will sort of examine you, and they might not let you pass. So in that guy's example, he was basically a prisoner in his own neighborhood because he couldn't go out through any of the security gates. If you want to get gasoline, you have to scan your face. You have to make all your passengers get out of the car, scan your face, go through a security gate, go to the pumps, scan your ID card to get the gasoline, and a record of how much gasoline you're buying will be attached to your sort of digital dossier. If you're walking down the street at sort of any moment, a police officer can wave you over, demand your smartphone, stick it into a smartphone scanner, and look through everything on your phone. And if you have, a digital Quran, or you have the photo of a Turkish movie star, or you have a encrypted chat app like WhatsApp or something like that on your phone that the Communist Party considers digital contraband, that's a black mark on your record, right? And you could be hauled off. It's essentially, that is, daily existence. And then there are also regular visits in your residential compound from local officials who come to check that there are the right number of people in that apartment. So every apartment has a QR code at the entrance that police officers and local officials can scan, and it will say who lives in that apartment, how many people. And if anyone is found in that apartment who doesn't live there, they can be interrogated, and rooms are often searched for Qurans and that sort of thing. So it's essentially just completely suffocating, constant surveillance and categorization all of the time. And the consequence for making a misstep, or for being related to someone or friends with someone who makes a misstep, could be being dragged off to an internment camp.
You used the word gulag earlier, and that's what this reminds me of in the little research I've done about the situation over there. What are the, quote unquote violations that would trigger a disappearance, being sent to a concentration camp? What, in your reporting on this, what do we know about the consequences or the actions that an individual could take or would take that would lead them to actually being physically removed against their will to one of these gulags?
Right. Yeah. So, one of we don't know the exact formula. That's difficult to say. And it seems to kind of differ from place to place. Some places had a point system. Other places seem to be more arbitrary and kind of at the whim of local police. But, one thing we did get from a Uyghur who escaped Xinjiang was a population data collection form, which was handed out in the early days of this campaign before they'd sort of digitized everything. But it was a paper form that every Uyghur was supposed to fill out. And it had questions that were sort of very revealing, right? And then, obviously the top were sort of basic, name, ID, birthday, that kind of thing. But then as you went down the form, there were questions about religious activity, right? So are you religious? What faith are you? And then the assumption obviously is that you're Muslim. So then, because the next questions are how many times a day do you pray? 1 through 5. Where do you pray? At a mosque, at home? How often do you go to a mosque? Did you have a religious teacher? Who is your religious teacher? And then lower down, questions about, have you traveled abroad? Do you have a passport? Do you know people abroad? Questions about your relatives, and age. Age was an important factor. They, if you were a young man in particular, you would fall under, more scrutiny than others. And so those are factors. If you were particularly religious, if you were caught going to a mosque, a little too often, and if you had contacts abroad, or especially if you had traveled to a Muslim majority country, that could get you in trouble. And then things just like having a there was a certain list of Turkish celebrities that were considered kind of Turkish nationalist figures, right? That if you had a photo of them or one of their songs or something on your phone, that would be an indication that you were a problematic type of person. But again, there was also guilt by association, right? So a lot of people who ended up in the camps, they ended up there just because they purely because they had relatives abroad who were criticizing the government, or because someone they knew had also gone to a camp, and it was just pure guilt by association.
As I hear that, and you tell me if you think this is incorrect, but it seems to me that there is a high level of arbitrariness to this, that you just don't really know. You're seeing neighbors disappear, and if you're in that neighborhood and you know that this is happening, you don't necessarily know why or when you might also be in that same boat. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair, and it's probably intentional, right? I mean, these sort of systems, previous systems, in totalitarian countries, we know have kind of been designed that way, right? The idea is that you never know what it is that can get you taken away. You just know that, you need to be on your best behavior all of the time. And, one of the people, the characters in the book, a Uyghur poet by the name of Tahir Hamid, who was the kind of the main Uyghur we wrote about. He just described sort of going around, and at a certain point he basically stopped going out because all anyone was talking about was who had been taken away, and the speculation about why, and nobody really knew. And at one point, one of his closest friends, who had actually been in the U.S., had already escaped Xinjiang, but had come back because he was worried that if he didn't go back, some friends of his might get in trouble. He just suddenly disappeared one day and was taken away. And to this day, I don't think Tahir knows why. And I think that's the case for most people. Yeah.
What do we know for the Uyghurs specifically who do get taken away and go to one of these gulags? What do we know about the circumstances in those, for lack of a better phrase, and you tell me if you think this is an inappropriate way to frame this, a concentration camp? They seem to be relatively close. What are the circumstances like inside these camps?
Yeah, so the camps, well, first of all, to sort of address the terminology issue, this was actually one thing that we really wrestled with early on in the reporting, was whether to translate them as concentration camps, because in Chinese, they actually, some of the Chinese phrasing is literally, if you translate it literally, it is concentration camp. Early on, we were like, we didn't really know very much about what was happening in them. We were sort of hesitant to describe them that way because it just obviously has this association with Nazi Germany. And really, there weren't mass deaths happening in these camps. So the intention was not to commit genocide in that sense. But they're sort of a 21st century reboot of concentration camps, right? And with a sort of Leninist twist, right? In the sense that the aim essentially was to re-engineer the thinking of Uyghurs, right? Their identities, their sort of, and their ideology. Which is a kind of very Leninist approach, right? This idea of brainwashing. Yeah. And so what we do know from people who came out, who were released later, is that, it was, people were basically jammed into, really tight quarters, and sort of made to, study Mandarin, because a lot of Uyghurs don't study Mandarin. They were also made to renounce Islam, pay, pledge allegiance to the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, and then, just absorb hour after hour of, patriotic movies and articles, and they were made to sing patriotic songs, and people who didn't comply, who didn't, weren't seen as making sufficient progress were often tortured. And there have been many accounts since then of rape for women, and a lot of just extremely poor conditions. So Uyghurs who did go in, there were several deaths, and they were usually of Uyghurs who went in with medical conditions that were basically neglected, and very, very rarely, I can't even think of a case that I know of where the people whose relatives died in the camps were given an explanation for their deaths. So that is what we know about them, and they're sort of, the aim was, basically to take Uyghurs who were sort of resistant to Chinese rule and basically kind of force them to assimilate.
Yeah. And as I hear you explain that, it seems like if there is disobedience, if there is dissent within the camps, there are harsh consequences. And I wonder, you just mentioned some of the details of what has happened in the camps. What do you know about the abuses, the torture, the really dark aspects of what can happen to people if they resist or if they're just in there in the first place?
Yeah, it's obviously difficult to corroborate any of these things because we can't be there. But a lot of people did sort of tell consistent stories, right? And after they came out, one thing that people often talked about was being strapped into what's known as a tiger chair, which is a kind of metal chair with shackles for the legs and arms that kind of that immobilizes you for interrogation. And several people reported being strapped into these chairs for hours, even days at a time, and deprived of sleep and interrogated endlessly. There were beatings, obviously, and humiliations like having your head shaved, things that sort of measures that are intended to kind of erase your identity, your sense of self, that are common with other camps like this that we know about. Some people reported being forced to eat pork or being made to believe that they were eating pork, which obviously, if you're Muslim, is a huge taboo. And so it's just all kinds of just a huge variety of torture and sort of mistreatment that was intended to kind of terrorize people into compliance.
Do we know at this point, roughly speaking, what the percentage of the Uyghur population has been subjected to these camps in general? Is there a rough understanding of what that looks like?
Yeah, it's difficult. Obviously, the Chinese government has never said. They've only denied estimates. They've never given an estimate of their own. I think on the most conservative end, you could say hundreds of thousands, many hundreds of thousands out of a population of 12 million. In some places, we have leaked documents that show as many as 20 to 30% of the population of a Uyghur village would be taken to camps. There have been various UN experts and other experts who've attempted to calculate this and estimate it. And I think, some of them fall on the high end of estimates around 1.3 to 1.5 million.
What is China's official position about this at this point? What have they conceded? What have they denied? What is their official statement about what is happening to the Uyghurs?
So the Communist Party, initially, they denied it was happening at all. And then after a sort of series of foreign media reports came out, they did admit to the existence of the camps. They referred to them as re-education centers, vocational training centers, and their official position, they deny, of course, any accusations of genocide, which some governments have leveled, including the State Department. They've called that the lie of the century, and instead, what they say is that this is an innovation in counterterrorism, and it actually that they've actually gone so far as to say other countries should learn from what they've been doing there.
Yeah, as I was reading your book, one of the components of the research that I wanted to go over with you was related to the details of the advancements in surveillance technology, and specifically, I know you spend time on the facial recognition capabilities, which it seems like have made massive progress from a technological perspective in the past few years. To a lay audience that is not familiar with what is capable at this point, what do we know about this technology? What is it capable of? When it's set up in a city, what kind of data can be obtained by a government who has set up these facial recognition technology cameras?
Right. So facial recognition technology, it is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's it's cameras that are matched with algorithms that are basically they take what's called a face print, which is it's not exactly a photo of your face, but it measures every face, and each face has like a unique combination of measurements, like the distance between the eyes, for example, or between the bottom of the nose and the top of the lip, or the sort of nostril and the chin, that sort of thing. And they take all these measurements, and the combination of those measurements is generally unique to each person. And they have, a police agency in China, for example, will have a database of people who they consider to be persons of interest, right? Which could be, an ex-con, a drug trafficker. They actually have 7 categories, that which also includes the mentally ill, and political dissidents, people who they say threaten social stability. And so they'll create a database of these people, of their face prints, and then they can set up cameras that will track a crowd in real time and check each face that passes by the camera against that database of people, and then send an alert to the police if they spot that person. And then they'll have a set of cameras networked around an area so that they can trace the movements of that person if they are a person of interest. And the capabilities are they're good and getting better all the time. The way that algorithms work is that the more data you feed into them, the better and more accurate they get. And China's advantage is that it's willing to use these technologies in real life, in the wild, is the way that is this sort of term of art. And as a result, they're kind of they're constantly collecting new data to feed back into the algorithms to improve them. So, it used to be that facial recognition was only really worked if you were you had a perfectly lit face facing the camera head on, right? But now, particularly in a place like Xinjiang, where they have 3D images of people's faces, they can identify you from a greater distance, even if there's shadows, even if you're wearing a mask, that sort of thing. And then the processing power on these is really amazing. One sort of government procurement document that we found for a local police department in central China, they were asking a company to build a system that I think it involved something like 5,000 cameras, and that would be able to retrace someone's steps over the course of a year, right? So they would track someone over the course of a year, and they had, stored images over the course of a year of someone's movements, and they'd be able to like search that person and track them within 5 seconds or something along those lines, right? So they have, so it's not just real time data, but it's also historical data, and it's really, it's quite impressive.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a very basic question, which is, why does this matter?
Well, it matters because these technologies have immense power to completely upend the way that human beings balance things like security and freedom, right? Or convenience and privacy. Because the benefits they offer in something like safety, for example, are immense, right? I mean, something like the facial recognition system I was just describing, it can track a criminal. It can track a criminal down better than anything we've ever had before, right? Yeah. And that's a really attractive idea. If you're the sort of person who's afraid of crime, that's really attractive. On the flip side, if you ever end up on the government's bad side, that technology is going to be turned against you, right? And so I think, and it's invasive in ways that we've just never, as human beings, ever experienced before, right? Like it essentially erases anonymity in public, potentially. And China is mapping out a way for governments to use these technologies to combine these with state power that is immensely alluring around the world. Like these Chinese companies are selling these technologies to dozens of countries. I think it's more than 80 countries as of 2020, at least 80, and including some democracies, right? So these technologies out there spreading, and it really has totally upended the calculations that we normally make about the sacrifices we're willing to put forth for security and convenience. So yeah. One of my all-time favorite movies is the movie The Lives of Others, which I would bet you probably have heard of or are familiar with. Yeah. And I believe it's set literally in the year 1984, and it's a fictional story of life in East Germany for, I think he was a playwright, and it was one of the best film representations to me of the power of surveillance and information and what a government can do to individuals when they essentially know everything about you. I remember when the Edward Snowden revelations were coming out and there were documentaries being made about it, and the American people got the ability to really learn the specifics about the reach and the detail of how much data the government was collecting on its own citizens, contrary to what they had been saying publicly. And I remember being at dinner parties, and these conversations would come up, and a consistent, response that I would hear was, "I have nothing to hide. It doesn't matter to me. I'm fine with this." Right. And yeah. I would love to put that comment to you and to have you respond to how you would respond to somebody with a response like that. Yeah, that it's funny you bring that up, because when Lisa and I first started working on this book, one of the things we did obviously was go out and talk to a bunch of Chinese people and say, "What do you think of all this?" And one of the responses we consistently got was exactly that, right? Yeah. If you haven't done anything wrong, what do you have to worry about? You're just making China look bad, like you want to make China look Orwellian, but if you're a regular law-abiding citizen, it's fine. And I think we sort of came to think of that as a Chinese response, because so those are the people we were interviewing, and we're like, okay, maybe Chinese people don't care about privacy that much, and so that's just a Chinese thing. But then I went to the U.S. to start doing reporting in the U.S. for the book, the most vivid example of this is I was in an airport in JFK, an airport line, security line, and there was a couple up in front of me, and the woman was commenting on some Western media report she'd read on her phone about state surveillance in China, and their husband turned around and said exactly that. And he's like, well, I don't see it. It's no big deal. If you haven't done anything wrong, it's fine. So, and that's when I realized, yeah, that is a universal response to this sort of thing. And I think it's natural. right? I think people don't want to think about this sort of thing, right? I mean, as a journalist in China, I sort of was forced to live with a constant paranoia about being watched even before I started looking into this topic, just because I think you would be naive not to assume that you're being tracked. And it was exhausting, it was just this kind of constant weight on your shoulders of having to think about ways you might be being tracked, or conversations you're having that might be being, listened in on. And so no one wants to think about that. Right. And, until it turns on them. And, in the China context, one of the cities that we visited, when we were doing the work for this book, is a place called Hangzhou, which is this, really beautiful, wealthy city, kind of 2 hours outside of Shanghai. It's a tech hub. It's home to Alibaba, which is, the big Chinese e-commerce company. And it's just loaded with state surveillance. I mean, the entire government there is digitized, and the local government works with Alibaba and a bunch of other companies to, and they've essentially got the flip side of Xinjiang, and that they have this really kind of almost digital utopia, or they're aiming for a kind of digital utopian sort of scenario there. But, it's a place where most people have a really generally benign view of these technologies. But it's also a place where there's a lot of construction going on. And one of the common things that happens in China is the government will essentially claim eminent domain and just knock down your apartment, right, in order to build a new, high-speed rail line or whatever. That's how Chinese infrastructure gets built, right? They don't have to worry about it. And what often happens is they don't pay market rate for your apartment. So, and this will happen to middle-class people, right? People who, like, one day they're living the Hangzhou dream and everything's great, and the next day their house is knocked down, and suddenly they're, like, protesting the government, and they're, like, going to Beijing to petition for justice. And then the surveillance system is trained on them. Then they're on a watch list. And then suddenly they kind of see the darker side of it.
Yeah. I thought when I was getting those response, years ago when the Snowden situation came out and his revelations were made public, that what was really lacking for me in the responses, in that response of "I have nothing to hide," was a lack of imagination.
Right.
A lack of imagination of how the future could unfold. And that while it probably in the next month, year was almost certainly not going to be a hindrance to your own life and your own freedom, you don't know where the future is heading. And I would imagine you have thought a good deal about this, and you just gave an example in the utopian version of China. But how else do you, as an exercise in imagination, what are some other circumstances that Chinese people and American people might want to keep in mind in terms of how this can really turn on you very quickly? Obviously, in the US, we're lucky in the sense that this kind of wholesale surveillance with this detail has not been implemented at this point. But what could potentially the future look like that would be, truly totalitarian in your estimation? What could unfold that could lead to this technology essentially eliminating human freedom altogether?
Yeah, we definitely have thought about this, and one of the sort of creepier and more amazing experiences I had reporting this was just reading through research that had been done by Communist Party scholars. That there's what's known as the Central Party School in Beijing, which is the kind of the elite training ground for top Communist Party officials, and the scholars there are sort of considered the cream of the crop of Communist Party thinkers, and a bunch of them have written these papers kind of imagining the future of the surveillance state, right? And they some of them are a little bit pie in the sky. They're like, someday everything in the world will be digitized, and we'll be able, we'll be able to sort of apply algorithms and data analysis to everything that exists. And that may or may not be the case, but some of the applications they're imagining are pretty wild. I mean, in one instance, for example, they said, well, we can apply this to students, right? So that we can have, we can suck in all the social media activity, the location data, everything we know about a student to predict which students are likely to kind of lose their way ideologically, right? Who are likely to sort of become enamored of the West or of some other system besides China's, and we can intervene early, right, to make sure that they stay on the path, and things like that. So, I mean, really kind of thought police level stuff, and whether they can pull that off, who knows? But it's part of their ambition. I mean, as you said, in the U.S., there are safeguards. Obviously, there's, we have the free press, we have courts, rule of law, that sort of thing, and those are all good. But there are, even already, there are futures in the U.S., near futures that some people will find disturbing, and one of those is now with the overturning of Roe versus Wade and the return of abortion bans. There are police departments, theoretically, police departments in states with abortion bans can get a warrant from a local judge and go to Google and with what's known as a ring fence warrant, right, which allows them to say to Google, give us the data of everyone who was within this area, say an abortion clinic at a given time. Right. Or they can also do keyword search warrants, which function the same way. Tell us everyone in, this given city that was searching for abortion drugs at a certain time. Right. And they'll just get a list of people who might have been secretly trying to get an abortion. So that's something that's not even a distant future. That's a maybe even already happening, but certainly a likely scenario in the future for American women.
Yeah, I know you spend a lot of time in the book detailing and profiling, giving some context and background on the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And again, I'm going to throw a very basic question to you about him, but when somebody asks you about who he is, how do you give an answer to that? Who is this man?
Xi Jinping is the most powerful Communist Party leader since Mao. I think you can make that argument now. He is a true believer in the party. He's the son of a revolutionary hero, Xi Jinping, considered one of the sort of key founders of the party. He came of age during the Cultural Revolution. His father was actually purged briefly during the Cultural Revolution, so he actually had a kind of a rough time. He was sent to the countryside and had to spend some of his formative years, digging ditches in a really impoverished part of China. He never really traveled much outside of China. But he believes in the Communist Party, and he believes that the party is inextricably linked with China's future as the only organization that can make China great again, and he's a pretty ruthless political operator. He's very, people in China sort of, they used to make fun of his education. They used to, kind of deride him as a country bumpkin because he didn't really get a great education, but he is undoubtedly a sort of master political tactician, and he's sort of rearranged the architecture of power in China in such a way that he's sort of unassailable now. And now he's using that power to kind of reorganize how the Communist Party controls the country.
You alluded to this earlier that this technology that we've talked about during this conversation, its details, what it's capable of, is not staying local to China, that it is being exported. What do we know about that situation? Where is this technology going? What are the other stories in the world, in your mind, that are worth sharing publicly about where the future might be heading, where this technology is going, and what that could mean for the citizens of other nations on Earth?
Right. So yeah, like I said, it's hard to find really reliable data on this. If you look at if you look at statements by the tech companies themselves, companies like Huawei, which a lot of people will recognize as a major Chinese telecom equipment maker, they claim to have sold state surveillance systems, which they market as safe city systems, to hundreds of cities and federal governments around the world. The number we feel comfortable with is somewhere in the 80 range. That, at least as of 2020, it's probably gone up a little bit since then. But it's all kinds of governments. It's your sort of usual suspect autocracies, but also some democracies. And I think the most important or most interesting subset of those are the countries that are kind of teetering on the border between democracy and authoritarianism. One example that we dug into was Uganda. Right, which is it's one of the wealthier, sort of more advanced sub-Saharan African countries. It's a major recipient of U.S. aid, but the leader there, Yoweri Museveni, he's a strong man. He's been in power for decades, and a few years ago he was facing a sort of new opposition challenger, this young former singer named Bobby Wine, who we met and who's just an incredibly charming and charismatic guy. He's from the ghetto. He sort of speaks, the ghetto language. Literally, he's actually kind of, his songs actually have sort of coined a lot of the lingo in Kampala. But he was challenging Museveni quite strongly, especially among younger people, and so Museveni went to the Chinese ambassador or had his security chief reach out to the Chinese ambassador and a few other people, sort of looking for solutions. And the Chinese ambassador brought in Huawei, which had helped build Uganda's telecom network. And together they flew a bunch of Ugandan police officials out to China, to Huawei's headquarters, and then to the Ministry of Public Security in Beijing, and sort of gave them the whole dog and pony show, and demonstrated how they use these systems to control things in China. And shortly after that, Museveni signed the deal, bought a sort of state surveillance starter kit from Huawei for $127 million. And in the last elections, he used it quite effectively to corral opposition supporters and to get them off the streets, and ultimately won the election. And it was actually an election that some people thought he might lose. So it is having an effect. It's not exactly like countries are replicating China's model perfectly, because that's actually not really, in some ways, it's not really possible, right? Like China it's a massive country with huge amounts of resources, huge amounts of data, top flight technology, and a really vast and sort of a fairly competent bureaucracy, right? And so they have a system that is perfectly set up to run a modern state surveillance system. Places like Uganda don't have all of that, but they can still use these technologies in ways that sort of serve to keep people like Museveni in power. So that is coming, and that's China is still actively selling these systems around the globe, and sort of promoting this notion that these technologies, that it is legitimate to use these technologies as a means to maintaining political power.
Yeah. I know in the book, and this is something that I learned and I hadn't known before, that the Tiananmen Square moment in 1989 was preceded by, I believe it was the death of a popular professor or intellectual who had advocated for reform. And I think among those was freedom of the press. And, if I am an average, quote unquote, Chinese citizen living in Beijing, Shanghai, perhaps I'm Han Chinese, and currently have this view that, what does it matter? I have nothing to hide. Do you view this, what's happening with the Uyghurs, as potentially a prototype that, the lessons, the learnings, the data the best practices, for lack of a better phrase, are being obtained on a relatively small portion of the Chinese population, and that if there is in the future a wave of enthusiasm for democratic reforms, for additional freedom, the government essentially has a playbook at hand already, or are learning a playbook right now that can effectively be implemented and squash dissent and enforce obedience. I'm guessing this is something that you have forecasted and thought about yourself, but I'd love to get any comments you might have about that specifically.
Right. Yeah. Actually, the person who died just before, whose death sort of set off the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, he was actually a reformist leader, not just a politician, a guy named Hu Yaobang. But he did advocate for sort of more liberal reforms, and that's always been something that since Tiananmen Square, the Communist Party has been deathly afraid of. Right. They sort of felt like they escaped with their life barely in that moment, and ever since they've been looking for ways to make sure that it never happens again. And I think you're right. In Xinjiang, they do have a template for sniffing out people who might have those sorts of tendencies, right, and then neutralizing them. And they have techniques, they have technology, they have systems, and they actually are actively doing that already, right? They have lists of dissidents. They know the people who sort of have these leanings. They have lists of those people, and they're adding to those lists all the time. And those people are subjected to similar levels of surveillance that you see in Xinjiang. But what I think is really interesting about and disturbing about the Xinjiang example, or Xinjiang as a laboratory, is that you actually now have seen the Communist Party take lessons from Xinjiang and apply them nationwide with the coronavirus pandemic. And that was, one of my most vivid personal experiences in all of this was, in early 2020, waking up one morning when, as news was spreading that the coronavirus had escaped Wuhan, coming down and seeing my residential compound basically locked down and blocked off so that only one entrance was left open, and everyone had to pass through it and be sort of interrogated about why they were going out and when they would be back and that sort of thing. And that is, it was striking because that's exactly how Uyghur residential compounds were being managed in Xinjiang. And then, shortly after that, you had the government roll out this system of health codes, which is a sort of smartphone-based system that tracks everyone's movements over the past 2 weeks, using sort of data from telecom operators and other forms of data to measure their exposure to COVID hotspots or to COVID patients. Right. And it would assign a rating to everyone based on that exposure. Right. So, and it was color coded. So it was, if you had gone through a hotspot or been having dinner with a COVID patient, your code would turn red. If not, if you were clear, then your code would be green. I think there was also a yellow code, although I've never really heard of anyone getting yellow but essentially if you were red, if your code came up red, you were very liable to be either locked down in your own apartment or more likely taken off to a quarantine center, right? So the parallels with Xinjiang were really, really clear.
Yeah. And I know, this is also a part of your story that I think you alluded to earlier that, I just have to get on record, but you personally, as I understand it, have, a unique experience of having the muscle of the Chinese government be imposed upon you. My understanding is that you are not welcome in that country anymore. And I would love to get the story from you as to what exactly happened and what you think about it now.
Right. So this also happened right around the time of the pandemic, actually not too long after I came down that morning in my residential compound to find it all locked up. And the background to this is there'd been sort of increasing tension between China and the U.S. throughout the Trump administration, and China was sort of just generally, very displeased with things that the Trump administration was saying. At the same time, the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, which is run completely separately from the news side of the journal, and separated by a 100-foot tall flaming firewall that no one crosses. The opinion page of the Wall Street Journal ran a headline describing China as the sick man of Asia amidst the pandemic, and a lot of people found it offensive, and the foreign ministry of China sort of seized on it, and made quite a big deal of it in the local media. The Wall Street Journal is blocked in China, so most people in China wouldn't have read that headline otherwise. But because of the foreign ministry, a lot of them saw it, and it became kind of a thing. And at one point, my bureau chief was called in to the foreign ministry, and it was actually his visa was up for renewal, and so he thought the meeting was about his visa getting renewed. He asked me to come along. He was new to the country, so he wanted me to go with him. We went there. They wouldn't let me into the meeting. They made me wait outside, and then he came out a few minutes later, and his face was kind of white, and I was like, "Oh my God, what happened? Did they kick you out?" And he's like, "No, they kicked you out." And it was me and two other reporters. And it was totally shocking. China had not outright expelled multiple reporters from the same news organization that way since in the post-Mao era, right? So it was totally unprecedented. We thought we would have time to kind of appeal it, but a half an hour later they announced it publicly, and so that was that. They gave us 5 days to pack up our stuff and get out. One of my colleagues actually who was expelled was in Wuhan at the time. And so she wasn't able to leave because the city was locked down, but they revoked her press card, so she couldn't do any reporting. So me and my other colleague, got on a plane to Japan, which was the only country that had open borders in Asia at the time, and kind of hung out there for a little while. But we never heard why they chose us, and we still don't know. So it's all speculation. I mean, I do know that they weren't happy with some of my reporting in Xinjiang in particular. They complained about it in the past. Whether that was a factor in my being selected, I don't know. But what happened subsequently was that the U.S. government then responded by kicking out a bunch of, or revoking the visas, at least, of a bunch of Chinese journalists. Then China retaliated again by kicking out all of the Americans who worked for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. So we're now in a situation where we're sort of the U.S. government and the Chinese government are negotiating on letting new reporters back in, but all of us, including myself, anyone who was expelled is officially not allowed back in the country, at least as of now.
Yeah. I know that over the past couple of years, and I think this is a fairly commonly held view, but Warren Buffett's right-hand man, Charlie Munger, I know, has commented on some of the freedom restrictions of China in the last 30-ish years or so, and on balance has the general view that for the gains made in terms of economic prosperity and standard of living, on balance, that it was a net positive of lifting people out of poverty, of increasing the welfare of the Chinese population in general. And I have to imagine this is something too that you have considered. It's a population that I believe is something like 4 to 5 times that of the United States, a country that has no historic DNA in liberal democracy or individual freedom. I think I heard you mention this in a podcast interview that I was listening to in preparation for this conversation, that the word privacy itself was not in, I guess, Mandarin or in the Chinese vocabulary until the 1990s. Given how different the cultures are, and I think it's interesting, last week I was interviewing Joe Henrich, who's a kind of biological anthropologist and teaches at Harvard, and he was mentioning part of his research is about just how differently the psychology tends to be between Westerners and non-Westerners in a whole variety of different areas. And you mentioned this too, that you're half Chinese as well, and I would imagine your family story, I would bet, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, is the story of so many Chinese people who have come to the U.S. for the freedoms that are not available in the Chinese mainland. And that was a long statement there, but I think in general, right? I mean, I read your book and I hear about what's happening in this massive country, and learn about what's happening to the Uyghurs, and learn about what is happening with the technology that they're advancing and utilizing. And it's such a violation of my own sense of what it means to be a human being, a free person, somebody who has autonomy. How do you think about that? Given what China is, what it has been historically, and in no way, I think it would be difficult to persuade me that there isn't something grossly wrong going on over there. I just wanted to put that to you to get any feedback you might have or thoughts you might have about the gains, right? To give the devil his due, what the Chinese Communist Party has been able to accomplish in getting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last 30 years. How you think about that? How you're able to balance the successes of that regime with the what I think are objective abuses of people that are still happening there. How do you think about that tension?
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I don't have like a really great one-line answer to this. I mean, it's definitely something I've struggled with basically my entire career, covering China, which I've been doing for more than 15 years. As a journalist, and particularly with this book, I try to be kind of conscious of all of this, right? I mean, one of my most profound experiences going to China when I was younger was figuring out just how American I am. You know, like when I was younger, I always tried to, I kind of identified with the Chinese half of my family, right? I would call myself Chinese and I sort of idolized my Chinese grandfather and I just imagined myself as being sort of like almost, fully Chinese. And then, it only took me a few months of living in China to realize, no, that's not at all the case. I'm definitely an American and my values are American and it's not even really close. And so, journalism about China is always generally really fraught for this reason, right? There's a big argument about, what is your role as a foreign correspondent? Are you there to sort of just describe what's happening? Is it you writing sort of postcards home just to like say, here's what's going on? Or are you covering China the way you would cover the US, holding China to the same standards you would hold the US government? Right. And I think, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. I think in China's case, because it's such an important country, right? Because it is the world's second largest economy, because so many American companies have business there. So many people from all over the world travel back and forth to it. And, I think we can cover it more critically. We can approach it more critically for that reason, right? It is a major part of how the world works. It has huge amounts of influence on how the world works. And for that reason, we all actually have a real stake in the decisions that the Communist Party makes. So, for example, something like Xinjiang, that sets a really, really dark precedent. It's combining, 21st century technology with one of the most reviled institutions of the 20th century, right? Mass incarceration of a religious minority, something that no one ever thought, or most people probably at least hoped would never come back. Right. And so that's something, just by virtue of doing that, I think, the Communist Party sets a sort of new, it sort of paves a path for other countries to follow. And I think, as citizens of the world, as cheesy as that sounds, I think, it's fair to be extremely critical of that and very concerned about it. Um, in terms of trying to evaluate whether the Communist Party has been good for China or not, I mean, that's a really complicated question. And it is true that under the Communist Party, at least in the last, in the post-Mao era, China has done well. I mean, it's had historic economic growth. Like no country ever in history has grown as quickly and experienced rising standards of living as quickly as China has. There's like no disputing that. And most Chinese people, I think, are happy with that. Right. I mean, most Chinese people do support the Communist Party. But it's, of course, it's because there's no free press there, because it's so hard to sort of have candid conversations with Chinese people, especially now that they've kicked a bunch of us out as reporters. It's hard to sort of really get a sense of how much people support the Communist Party, but they do. I mean, there is a baseline of support there. So, I mean, that's a totally, I'm sure, unsatisfying and meandering answer. But it's, it's a country of 1.4 billion people, and it's incredibly complex. In the end, you can sort of find examples to back up any narrative you kind of want to spin out of China. But I think the honest one is that it's really complicated, but it's one that we do have a stake in.
Yeah. I know we're getting somewhat close to the end of the conversation. There are just a couple more topics that I know I wanted to get your feedback on and your thoughts on. And one, and I know this, I don't know if this is directly addressed in the book itself, but one is about the primary social media platform that young Americans are using right now, and undoubtedly I will be utilizing to try to promote and share the information from this conversation, which is TikTok. TikTok is a Chinese company, and I don't know how much reporting you have done on this. It's very possible that the information that I will do my best to blast onto that platform might get censored. But it is extraordinarily popular with Americans. What advice would you have for young Americans who are putting so much of their own identity, lives, information on this platform? What do we know about the potential risks of TikTok itself and how it might be utilizing the data it is getting every day? What do you say to that? What is worth knowing about what we know about that company?
Right. So, I mean, I'll say off the top here that I haven't done a lot of really in-depth reporting on TikTok and on ByteDance. It's the company, the Chinese company that owns TikTok. Several of my colleagues have, and have certainly paid a lot of attention to it. I think the thing to realize about TikTok is that it is owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance. That company's founder actually is a really fascinating character, and I think, by all accounts, he sort of sees himself in the mold of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Those are the people he worships. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and that sort of thing. I mean, he's not a Communist Party apparatchik, right? But in some ways, it doesn't really matter because it is a Chinese company, and as a Chinese company, its future is tied to the Communist Party, and every company in China, including foreign companies, actually has a Communist Party cell, and that party cell has immense influence over operations, or it can exert immense influence over operations when the party feels it needs to. So we don't have evidence of TikTok sharing American user data with China, and they claim that they don't. And that may be the case. But if the Communist Party really wants that data, it's hard to imagine a way in which ByteDance and TikTok can refuse them. Yeah. What China would do with that data, I don't know. But one of the examples that I remember from back in the day that's probably a little bit clearer was with Grindr.
Yeah.
The dating app in which a Chinese company was trying to buy a controlling stake in it, and people in the State Department were really concerned because there were a lot of government employees on that app, and military, other folks, and there was concern that the Chinese government could use that data to blackmail, members of sort of key government employees who maybe weren't out, who were secretly on the app. So there is concern. We just don't know what the government could do with that data, but they theoretically can access it.
Yeah. Last question I want to ask you, and before I do that, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation. I know how busy you are, and for me as a generally cheerleading American, I think this is one of the beautiful things about our country is our ability to have these kind of candid conversations that you mentioned can be extremely difficult to have in China, and get the information that you have obtained from your reporting. And I want to end the conversation by asking you about the future in general. And to me, one of the primary takeaways thus far from the year 2022 in its chaos is a clarity, at least to my mind, about the West and the elements of the West that actually matter. It can become cliche that we live in the free world, but I think when you learn about some of the details of what is happening in China, what is going on with Russia, we certainly have our own problems here. But it is a reminder, I think, to me, just as a citizen in this country, that there is a preciousness to what we have inherited in this country that I think is objectively a net good and a positive for humanity, and something that is the exception to the rule in history. And I'd like to close just by asking you about how you think about the future, and both the future about this country and the future of China, and how you see this likely unfolding over the next 5 to 10 years, or even a generation. I guess specifically to whether this is sustainable within China, and how you think about, obviously no one knows for sure, but the spidey sense, the intuition, the just general judgment probability call that you think about what might be coming, or what may be going on in China, its potential thriving or collapse. How do you think about that? How do you think about how surveillance will affect the history of that country and our own country in general?
Yeah, I think China's path. You never say never with China, but I think its path is more or less set, at least in the near future, the near to medium term. Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, is next month is likely to get a third term as president, which will probably lead to then lifetime tenure.
Yeah.
And he's sort of cleared out a lot of the barriers to his agenda. Certainly he's done things, including insisting on zero COVID, even to this day, that have angered people. But he's just so in control of the levers of power in China. It's hard to see him being his grip being broken. And so I think you'll just see the surveillance state in China sort of continue to grow and get more sophisticated, now that they've had this response to COVID, and they sort of have this infrastructure in place to track everyone in the country. The sort of one of the biggest barriers they had to really fully realizing the surveillance state has sort of crumbled now, right? So they have. Yeah. So I think you're just going to see that get more and more sophisticated. I think you're going to continue to see Chinese tech companies exporting surveillance elsewhere, and that's partly just by economic necessity. There's, two of the world's largest surveillance security camera makers are actually the two largest are based in China, Hikvision and Dahua. And China's a big market. They can sell domestically, but China already has more than 400 million or so surveillance cameras. They don't actually need that many more. And so those companies are just as a matter of bottom line, are looking for other markets. And so those systems are going to continue spreading around the world. And I think, for Americans, for people in the West, the thing that's scary about this is that China, alluded to this a little bit earlier, but China offers a really simple vision of the future, right? And that is sort of authoritarian government matched with cutting edge technology. And they have a positive vision of this, right? Their idea is that you can sort of take, sort of like, a government version of Google, right? You can harvest enough data and apply the right algorithms to it, and you can essentially engineer a perfect society, right? You can basically engineer a society that is safe and predictable and convenient, and that will not have dissidents because no one can possibly complain about it, right? That's the sort of ultimate vision that they're selling, and it's one that very few other countries could even dream of implementing, but a lot of them I think will buy it, right? Because it's simple. And because we're, everything else in this era with climate change, with COVID, with Russia and the war in Ukraine, everything seems so unstable and chaotic. I think the appeal of simple answers is even greater now than it has been in the past. So, the democracies, I think you're right. We do have something precious, right? And what we've inherited is rare and valuable. I think the challenge is to realize that those institutions, those safeguards that they require, care and feeding, right? They require maintenance and attention, and they will sort of keep, a surveillance state from arising, and they are capable of keeping a sort of Chinese-style surveillance state from arising in the United States, but only if they're applied, right? Only if they're used. So we have a free press, and you need a free press to do. You need media to expose abuses of these technologies. You need courts to uphold rules and laws against their abuses. You need politicians to sort of pass those rules and legislate them and regulate. But that has to happen, right? There has to be an active effort and an active conversation. It's not, otherwise, we'll sort of get what we got with social media, right? Where we were sitting around and we're like, oh, this is kind of cool. but no one was really thinking about the consequences down the line. And now our politics have been sort of radically altered as a result. So yeah, I think we have a fight on our hands is basically the final conclusion for me.
Yeah. And in that fight, we have the maintenance of your book and the information of your book. And Josh, I just want to say again, I really appreciate you doing this. And I think I speak for a lot of people in expressing gratitude for your years of hard work and reporting and willingness to commit yourself to sharing this information. It was a pleasure to meet you, man.
Yeah, it was my pleasure too, Dan. I really enjoyed this.
Likewise. Good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you're finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show via the links below on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Your support helps to make these conversations possible.